The laughter started near the chart table, brittle and confident. A Japanese staff officer, his tunic immaculate, his tone tinged with the smug certainty of the victorious, had just finished reading a captured Allied broadcast about jeep carriers, small American aircraft carriers supposedly rolling off assembly lines like trucks. He snorted and turned to his peers. Carriers built like automobiles? Ridiculous. The Americans confused toys with warships around the wardroom. Heads nodded. The Imperial Navy had spent 2 decades perfecting its carriers, cathedrals of precision steel constructed over years, not weeks. No serious navy could build fighting ships on a stopwatch. Outside, the lagoon shimmered with deceptive calm. Dozens of ships rode at anchor beneath a sky as clear as glass. The air carried the metallic scent of aviation fuel and salt, mingled with the distant thrum of engines warming on the flight decks of anchored carriers. Beneath this illusion of strength, Japan's naval empire was already running on borrowed time, its oil reserves measured in months, its shipyards stretched to exhaustion, its industrial output throttled by scarcity. Yet inside the wardroom, paper and pride painted a different picture. Spread across the table lay the latest intelligence summaries from Tokyo, neatly typed, logically organized, and fatally wrong. They assured that America's shipbuilding was impressive but limited, that the United States, for all its factories, could not produce major warships faster than Japan could destroy them. "The Americans build too big, too slow," one officer read aloud. "Their industrial chaos will defeat itself." There was a murmur of agreement. Someone joked that Yankee production lines might better serve Japan if they focused on Coca-Cola instead of carriers. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did not laugh. He sat apart, his expression measured, the cigarette burning to ash between his fingers. Unlike his staff, he had seen the machinery of America up close, its car plants, its assembly lines, its boundless appetite for scale. Years earlier, as naval attaché in Washington, Yamamoto had walked through Detroit's auto works and shipyards, watched steel and oil transformed into motion by the thousands, and understood what that meant. He knew the rhythm of American production, an unceasing pulse that could, when focused, turn peacetime factories into forges of war. He tapped the intelligence summary once with his index finger. "We should not measure America by our standards," he said quietly. "They build differently. Faster. Cruder, perhaps, but faster." His staff exchanged looks, half respectful, half dismissive. One captain smiled politely. "With respect, Admiral, a carrier is not a truck." "No," Yamamoto replied, eyes fixed on the map of the Central Pacific, "but the men who build trucks now build carriers." Silence followed, thin as paper. In that silence lay the hidden thesis of the Pacific War, that calculators, cranes, and calendars would prove as decisive as torpedoes and tactics. Japan's officers still thought in tons and guns, but America was thinking in days and deadlines. While the Imperial Navy obsessed over craftsmanship, the US Navy and its industrial partners were learning to mass-produce complexity, to trade elegance for velocity. In a few months, American shipyards at Vancouver and Portland would prove Yamamoto right beyond imagining, launching Escort carriers in roughly 100 days from keel to commission, a tempo that no Japanese planner believed possible. Yamamoto's realism was not cynicism, but mathematics. He knew the limits of Japan's steel mills, the fragile logistics of its oil convoys, the bottlenecks strangling its shipyards. He knew that even victory at sea could not overcome arithmetic. Each new carrier Japan launched cost precious months. Each American carrier built would require only weeks. The equation had already begun to turn. The staff officer who had laughed first refolded his intelligence sheet, unconvinced. "Rumors," he said. "Even the Americans cannot turn rivers into factories." But on the far side of the Pacific, the Columbia River shipyards were already doing exactly that. laying keels in rows, welding modules by the clock, and proving that abundance could be a form of strategy. Later that night, Yamamoto walked alone along the deck of his flagship, the dark lagoon broken only by the glint of starlight on water. Somewhere out there, unseen, was an enemy he understood better than his own subordinates did, a nation not of warriors but of workers, whose power lay not in ceremony but in repetition. He thought of their factories, their trains of steel and coal, their endless assembly lines, and he felt a chill that no tropical air could warm. War, he knew, was no longer merely about courage or cunning. It was about time. The side that could compress it, command it, and weaponize it would own the future. In 4 days, Yamamoto would die, his aircraft intercepted and destroyed by American P-38s, whose very existence proved his fears correct. But on this April night at Truk, he understood something his nation refused to see, that the Pacific would not be won by heroes alone, but by the invisible armies of engineers, welders, and foremen, measuring victory in shifts, schedules, and the relentless ticking of the industrial clock. In January 1943, a thick fog hung over the Columbia River, muffling the metallic clang of hammers and the hiss of welding torches. At the Vancouver yard, one of Henry J. Kaiser's sprawling shipbuilding empires, engineers in oil-stained coveralls stood around a table littered with blueprints that looked more like factory schematics than naval architecture. On the corner of the largest drawing, someone had scrawled a number that made seasoned officers shake their heads: 100 days. That was Kaiser's promise, to build an aircraft carrier from keel to commissioning in less than the span of a single season. To the Navy's Bureau of Ships, it was lunacy. Carriers were not liberty ships. They were complex, temperamental instruments of war, each a floating airfield requiring precision beyond anything Kaiser's modular production lines had ever attempted. The admirals in Washington saw his proposal as industrial arrogance. "You can't mass-produce warships like automobiles," one commander scoffed. "Every carrier is a handcrafted machine." But Kaiser had already rewritten one law of naval warfare: speed of construction. His shipyards had delivered Liberty ships faster than submarines could sink them, collapsing build times from months to weeks. Now he was gambling that the same principle, modular construction, prefabrication, and unrelenting tempo, could scale to carriers. The idea seemed absurd: slice a capital ship into manageable sections, build them simultaneously in different sheds, and weld them together like puzzle pieces. It was engineering by stopwatch. In Washington, the Navy's skepticism was barely concealed. Rear Admiral Howard Vickery, head of the emergency shipbuilding program, recalled the meeting when Kaiser pitched his carrier-a-week plan. "It was half showmanship, half heresy," Vickery said later. He spoke of sections and sub-assemblies, of cranes instead of slipways, of yards working like clock factories. I think he frightened the room more than he convinced it. But the war in the Pacific was accelerating, and production was falling behind need. Japan still held the initiative, its carrier force crippled but not destroyed, while America's fleet carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, Essex, were too few and too precious for convoy duty or patrol work. The Navy needed small carriers, fast, escort ships capable of protecting convoys, ferrying aircraft, and supporting amphibious operations. These would not be elegant ships, nor even fast ones. They would be enough, and that was a language Henry Kaiser spoke fluently. His design partner, the Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation, delivered the engineering basis: a 512-foot-long hull built on the proven C-3 cargo ship frame, topped with a 477-foot flight deck and powered by diesel engines instead of steam turbines. The ship would carry 28 aircraft, crewed by 900 men, and could make 19 knots, modest by fleet standards, but adequate for its mission. The Casablanca-class Escort carrier had been born, though no one yet realized it would become the most produced aircraft carrier class in history. At Vancouver, Kaiser's foreman began transforming blueprints into steel reality, prefabricated sections, deck houses, engine rooms, hull segments, were laid out in parallel bays. Welders worked around the clock under arc lights that turned the riverfront into a daylight forge. Components arrived by rail and river barge, turbines from Cleveland, electrical panels from San Francisco, radar sets from Boston. To an old-line naval constructor, it was chaos. To Kaiser, it was choreography. Navy inspectors muttered about quality. The welds were rough, the tolerances coarse, the schedules reckless. "We're not building jewelry," Kaiser retorted. "We're building weapons." He banned bottlenecks, replaced paperwork with chalk marks on steel, and measured progress in hours, not days. By March, the first hull, CVE 55, later christened Casablanca, was rising from the ways. Her prefabricated sections fit together with an almost insolent precision. Visitors from the Bureau of Ships, expecting disorder, found instead a humming industrial ballet, cranes lifting 1,000-ton modules into place, teams sealing seams with sparks and smoke. When Casablanca slid into the Columbia on April 5, 1943, just 3 months after her keel was laid, the skeptics were forced to recalibrate their math. The launch wasn't just a ship entering the water, it was a new tempo of war. Within weeks, the second hull followed, then the third. By summer, Vancouver and its sister yard at Portland were launching escort carriers faster than Japan could replace the ones it had lost. Henry Kaiser had gambled that quantity could become a form of strategy, that the Pacific could be won not only by admirals and aviators, but by welders and cranes. The Navy's traditions said it was impossible. The Columbia River proved otherwise. On March 3, 1944, a steel keel touched the blocks at the Kaiser shipyard in Vancouver, Washington. The name was not yet chosen. It would come later. But the number was already written in grease pencil on the foreman's board, CVE 100. Beside it, another number glowed with impossible ambition, 107 days. That was the yard's target, from first weld to full commission. Not launch, not sea trials, commission. For centuries, shipbuilding had been measured in years. Wooden men of war took half a decade, dreadnoughts at least 3, even America's fast Essex-class fleet carriers required 18 months. Yet here, in a muddy yard on the Columbia River, a new kind of miracle was underway. An industrial miracle built not on craftsmanship, but on choreography. Kaiser's engineers called it parallel construction. Instead of a single hull taking shape from keel upward in one slow crescendo, multiple sections were built at once, each a self-contained chapter of the ship's anatomy. One bay produced the engine rooms, another the hangar deck, another the island structure. When finished, cranes weighing hundreds of tons lifted these prefabricated sections into place like blocks of an enormous puzzle. Bolts met bolts, weld seams met weld seams, pipes aligned as if guided by magnetism. The ship that would be named USS Bougainville CVE 100 was an essay in standardization. She measured 512 feet long, displaced 10,400 tons, and carried a crew of about 900. She was neither fast nor elegant, but she was fast to build. Her engines, twin Skinner Uniflow reciprocating steam engines, were chosen not for grace, but for speed of manufacture. Turbines, the Navy's preference, were intricate and in short supply. Every turbine sent to a Casablanca-class escort carrier was one less for a fleet destroyer or cruiser. The Uniflow engines, adapted from merchant ship designs, could be built in smaller machine shops scattered across the country. They were loud, heavy, and old-fashioned, but they worked, and they could be produced now. The miracle was not in invention, but in discipline. Every piece of the ship, from bulkhead to bunk, was drawn to identical specifications used across the entire Casablanca class. The same electrical layouts, the same rivet patterns, the same wiring harnesses arrived from subcontractors who never saw the river but knew their deadlines to the hour. A man who had wired the galley of CVE 98 could step into CVE 100 and know every switch by heart. Day 0 to 10. The keel blocks were aligned, and prefabricated frames began arriving from off-site fabrication shops. Workers, many of them women, Kaiser's welders, as the press called them, worked in 12-hour shifts. Sparks and smoke drifted over the river like industrial incense. Day 11 to 40. The hull sections rose with startling speed. Where older shipyards still relied on riveters and incremental plating, Kaiser's crews welded pre-fitted assemblies, each protested before installation. 1,000 parts came by rail each day, steam fittings from Chicago, electrical cables from Los Angeles, deck plating from Pittsburgh, and within 6 weeks, the bare skeleton of a carrier stood complete. Day 41 to 70. The flight deck, 477 feet of Douglas fir sheathed in steel, was lowered onto the hull in panels. The bridge island, complete with radar mast, was hoisted into place in a single lift. In old yards, such work would have taken months of staging and scaffolding. In Vancouver, it took 2 days. Inside the ship, plumbers ran piping while electricians wired lighting and radar circuits. Every trade worked simultaneously, outfitting in parallel rather than sequence. Day 71 to 90. The ship floated free. Dock trials began. Boilers hissed, shafts turned, and the Uniflow engines shuddered into life. Testers noted the characteristic rhythmic thump of reciprocating pistons, inefficient perhaps, but steady as a clock. Navy inspectors ticked through checklists and found the work rough-edged but sound. Good enough was no insult here, it was a declaration of wartime necessity. Day 91 to 107. Final painting, provisioning, and crew move-in. The ship's decks smelled of primer and pine. Her mess halls gleamed with new enamel tables. The crew joked that the paint was still wet when they took their bunks, and they were not far wrong. On June 18, 1944, Bougainville was commissioned, exactly 107 days after her keel was laid. Her captain read the orders aloud, while cranes behind him were already swinging modules for the next hull into place. There was no champagne, no brass band, just a whistle from the yard foreman and a chorus of hammer strikes echoing off the riverbanks. When the news reached Washington, even the Bureau of Ships, once derisive of Kaiser's factory carriers, was forced to acknowledge the feat. A fleet carrier like Lexington or Essex took 18 months. Bougainville had gone from blueprint to battle-ready in barely 3. What she sacrificed in speed and armour, she repaid in multiplication. Kaiser's system was imperfect. His carriers rolled in heavy seas, their thin hulls groaned under strain. But they existed. 50 Casablancas would follow Bougainville down the ways in the next 20 months. Each was a small, moving piece of America's industrial answer to war, each a 10,000-ton argument that mass production could replace heroism as the measure of national strength. A century of naval tradition had said ships were singular works of art, measured by beauty, endurance, and the skill of their builders. But in 1944, the Bougainville proved a different gospel, that victory belonged not to perfection, but to the clock. America had learned to build ships the way it built time, reliably, relentlessly, and in sequence. And in the Pacific, time itself was becoming the most powerful weapon of all. The stopwatch began ticking on March 3, 1944. At 7:12 a.m., the first section of a new escort carrier, designated CVE 100, was lowered onto the keel blocks at Henry Kaiser's Vancouver yard on the Columbia River. A foreman chalked the date on a steel frame, then wrote a second number beneath it in bold white strokes. 107 days. That was the target from first weld to commissioning. It was not a boast, it was a deadline. Across the United States, shipbuilding remained a craft shaped by sequence and patience. A hull was laid down, its ribs raised, its plating added one sheet at a time. Fittings followed structure, engines followed fittings, and only after the whole was complete did crews begin outfitting. It was a linear, almost ceremonial process. a ship taking shape the way a cathedral rose, stone by stone. Kaiser's method tore that tradition apart. At the Vancouver yard, the Bougainville, her name not yet assigned, was not so much built as assembled. Each section of the ship was constructed simultaneously in multiple bays. The hangar deck took form in one shed, the engine rooms in another, the island superstructure in a third. When completed, these modules, some weighing over 100 tons, were hoisted by gantry cranes and welded together like components of a massive jigsaw puzzle. It was shipbuilding transposed into the rhythm of a factory floor. Kaiser's engineers called the system section-by-section assembly, but the workers had a simpler name, block building. Welders and fitters worked around the clock in 12-hour shifts, sparks spilling over the riverbank like orange rain. At night, the yard looked like a constellation fallen to earth, thousands of arcs flickering beneath the black Washington sky. The heart of this new miracle was parallel outfitting. Instead of waiting for the hull to be complete before installing electrical, plumbing, and ventilation systems, Kaiser's crews did everything at once. Electricians wired lighting into unmounted bulkheads while they were still on the ground. Plumbers installed piping into prefabricated compartments before they were ever lowered into the hull. The result was a production tempo so compressed that by the time a new section was added to the ship, it was already half finished inside. To traditional naval engineers, this was heresy. A warship, they argued, was a living organism. It demanded order, not chaos. But the Bureau of Ships had learned the arithmetic of desperation. Fleet carriers like Essex took 18 months to complete, and Japan still prowled the Pacific. The Navy needed hulls in the water, not blueprints on paper. So, under quiet protest, it let Kaiser's experiment proceed. The Bougainville was an industrial hybrid, part warship, part merchant hull. Her frame was based on the standard C3 cargo ship design, adapted to carry a 477-foot flight deck. Beneath that deck, her propulsion system reflected the logic of urgency. Instead of sleek steam turbines, she carried twin Skinner Uniflow reciprocating engines, each producing 9,000 horsepower. These engines, relics of a bygone era, were simple to build, easy to maintain, and could be produced in dozens of small machine shops across the country. They were noisy, they vibrated, and they bled efficiency, but they were available. On the shop floor, the ship's assembly unfolded like a countdown. Day 1 to 20. Steel ribs rose on the slipway while hull plates arrived from subcontractors already shaped to specification. Every piece was numbered, colour-coded, and tracked like an assembly line part. Day 21 to 50. Prefabricated modules began to arrive by rail, each marked with chalk tags like CVE 100 Aft Bulkhead Section 4B. The island structure, pre-wired and pre-plumbed, was lifted into place in a single operation that took just 18 minutes. Day 51 to 80. Crews swarmed through the ship like ants in a metal hive. Painters following welders, electricians following pipe fitters, all working simultaneously. Every 12 hours, the yard whistle signalled the next phase. Every day lost meant a penalty in morale, not money. Day 81 to 100. The ship was afloat, her hull plates sealed and her machinery tested. The Uniflow engines, clattering like giant sewing machines, turned the propeller shafts for the first time on June 10th. "She shudders, but she runs," a machinist wrote in his logbook. Day 107, June 18th, 1944. The newly christened USS Bougainville, CVE 100, was commissioned into the United States Navy. Her decks still smelled of primer. Paint flaked beneath the boots of her first crew. But she was alive, powered, armed, and ready for war, barely 15 weeks after the first weld. Rear Admiral Vickery, who had once mocked Kaiser's methods, sent a brief message from Washington. "You've proven the impossible practical." The Bougainville's imperfections were many. Her hull was thin. Her flight deck flexed under heavy landings. Her engines rattled themselves hoarse at full speed. But her schedule, her 107-day genesis, was the true weapon. By year's end, Kaiser's yards would deliver a new Casablanca-class carrier every week. Japan could destroy ships faster than it could replace them. America, by contrast, had learned to replace them faster than they could be destroyed. When the Bougainville steamed out into the Pacific, her decks filled with freshly trained pilots and FM-2 Wildcats, she carried more than planes. She carried a revolution. She was proof that the old order of naval construction, measured in blueprints and craftsmanship, had given way to a new calculus of time, labour, and logistics. In that equation, elegance was no longer a virtue. Schedule was salvation. And America, for the first time in history, had learned how to mass-produce miracles. At dawn on April 18, 1943, a twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber lifted off from Rabaul's Lacouni airfield, its silver fuselage glinting in the tropical haze. Inside sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor and, in so doing, set the Pacific ablaze. His itinerary was meticulously scheduled, a morale inspection tour of forward bases across the Solomon Islands, beginning at Buen on Bougainville. The staff expected the usual punctual precision. Yamamoto was nothing if not punctual. He did not know that the Americans were already waiting for him. From a small intelligence shack on Guadalcanal, U.S. naval cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code JN-25D. The decrypted message, intercepted just hours earlier, laid out Yamamoto's travel plan with fatal exactitude. Aircraft type, route, time of departure, and even his seating arrangement. The message was relayed to Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area. Within hours, a plan was devised, Operation Vengeance. The mission: intercept and kill the mastermind of Japan's naval war. Yamamoto's own words had authored his fate. 2 years earlier, as Japan debated war, he had written privately to Prime Minister Konoe, warning of the industrial gulf between the two nations. "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that I can give no expectation of success." He had studied in America, travelled its endless plains, seen its factories, its railroads, its boundless capacity to build. He knew what his nation did not, that Japan's victories were borrowed time, purchased on credit from a smaller economy fighting a larger one. The war had reached its 11th month since Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's 6 months had expired. At 7 a.m., his aircraft, accompanied by an escort of 6 Zero fighters, settled into formation at 6,500 feet, droning southeast along the jungle coastline. To the north, climbing invisibly from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, 18 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings raced toward an intercept point 400 miles away. It was a mathematical pursuit, planned down to the minute. The P-38s, the only Allied fighters with the range to reach Bougainville and return, were stripped of armour and fitted with auxiliary fuel tanks. Their pilots, from the 339th Fighter Squadron, flew low over the sea to avoid radar detection. The intercept was timed for 9:34 a.m. near Kahili airstrip on Bougainville's southern tip. Each P-38 pilot carried a slip of paper with the expected time and coordinates. They did not know their target by name, only that it was a high-value officer. At 9:34:30, Captain Thomas Lanphier spotted 2 twin-engine bombers glinting against the morning sun, with 6 zeros above them. He keyed his radio. "Bogies at 11 o'clock high." The Lightnings dropped their tanks and climbed into combat. Seconds later, the air exploded into fire and contrails. Lanphier rolled into the bomber's path, firing in a high deflection burst. His wingman, Rex Barber, came up beneath the second bomber and fired into its right engine. Yamamoto's plane shuddered, trailed smoke, and began to roll. The G4M, nicknamed the Flying Cigar for its elongated fuselage and notorious lack of armour, was a death trap once hit. It cartwheeled into the jungle, tearing through the canopy in a gout of flame. The admiral who had defined Japan's naval war died instantly, his hand still clutching the hilt of his ceremonial sword. His watch, recovered by a Japanese search party hours later, was stopped at 9:35 a.m. In Tokyo, the news was delayed for weeks, wrapped in silence and euphemism. Officially, Yamamoto had died in combat. Unofficially, the shock rippled through the fleet. He had been more than a strategist. He was a symbol of rational calculation within a system that thrived on fatalism. His death was not just the loss of a commander, it was the extinguishing of Japan's last realist. For the Americans, Operation Vengeance was both triumph and omen. The P-38s had flown 1,000 miles round-trip without navigation beacons, striking their target within 60 seconds of the planned time. It was a technical and logistical masterpiece, proof that intelligence, planning and industrial capacity could converge into surgical destruction. The intercept demonstrated the reach of American technology, the precision of its logistics, and the fruits of its production lines. Aircraft with the range to kill across oceans, pilots trained by the thousands, and fuel supplies measured in abundance rather than ration. To Yamamoto's subordinates, the symbolism was unbearable. The man who had warned Japan that the United States would outbuild, outproduce, and outlast them had been slain by a weapon that embodied that very truth. In a sense, April 18, 1943, marked the end of illusion. Japan's war planners could still dream of decisive battles and divine wins, but their most clear-eyed strategist was gone, felled not by chance or heroism, but by the cold arithmetic of industrial warfare. From that day forward, the war would belong to those who could translate blueprints into machines, fuel into movement, time into dominance. Yamamoto had called it Sangaku, the mountain of numbers. He knew it would not be bullets that buried Japan, but the avalanche of America's steel and calculation. On the jungle floor of Bougainville, amid the wreckage of his shattered aircraft, that mountain had finally come down. By the summer of 1944, the Columbia River was launching warships faster than charts could track them. From Kaiser's yards at Vancouver and Portland, grey hulls slid into the water in assembly line rhythm, one a week, sometimes more. But the true genius of the Casablanca-class Escort carriers, CVEs, was not their number alone. It was how swiftly these hastily welded hulls were transformed into function. Each new CVE represented a ripple of acceleration through the entire American war machine. Once commissioned, a carrier like Bougainville or Fanshawe Bay immediately entered a logistical ecosystem designed to exploit speed. These ships became multipliers, replenishment carriers bringing replacement aircraft and pilots to the fleet, ferry carriers delivering planes across the Pacific, and close support platforms hammering beaches from Tarawa to Okinawa. Every hull delivered was not just a ship, it was time, converted into killing power. The Navy quickly realized that these baby flattops could do almost anything except duel with fleet carriers. Their flight decks launched Wildcats and Avengers for convoy defense one week, and the next they were transferring fresh squadrons to forward bases in the Marshalls. A Casablanca could carry nearly 30 aircraft, half of them crated spares, and sail with minimal escort thanks to radar and depth charge gear. Wherever one of Kaiser's carriers appeared, it shortened the logistical chain by hundreds of miles. This tempo reached beyond steel. The faster hulls arrived, the faster pilot training expanded. Replacement carriers kept air groups supplied with new aircraft and aviators trained in carrier landings before they ever reached the combat zone. The U.S. Navy's flight schools, synchronized with ship delivery schedules, turned out thousands of carrier-qualified pilots each month. Every CVE delivered meant another mobile classroom on the Pacific, each deck a rehearsal for the next invasion. By late 1944, these escort carriers were redefining amphibious warfare. Fleet carriers struck deep. CVEs lingered close. During the Mariana and Palau operations, squadrons from Casablanca-class ships flew continuous close air support for Marines ashore, flying hundreds of sorties per day in tight coordination with naval gunfire. They lacked speed but compensated with endurance, remaining on station for weeks thanks to their simple machinery and low fuel consumption. At Leyte Gulf, CVEs would even find themselves fighting Japan's main fleet, turning into reluctant heroes when Admiral Clifton Sprague's Taffy 3 squadron of escort carriers faced off against battleships and cruisers. Though never designed for such combat, their existence at that moment was a direct consequence of Kaiser's clockwork production. They were there because America could build them faster than Japan could imagine them. Behind every sortie and bombardment lay the arithmetic of the shipyard. A hull completed in 100 days meant fresh aircraft for the front, new pilots for the rotation cycle, and another step forward in the relentless calendar of Pacific offensives. Industrial tempo had become strategic tempo. From the keel blocks of Vancouver to the beaches of Saipan, the connection was unbroken. Steel delivered from the river turned into wings over the islands. Each escort carrier was a bridge between factory and front line, a 10,000-ton promise that America could not only replace what was lost, but multiply it. In the Pacific War, the true weapon was not the bomb, the torpedo, or the gun. It was the schedule. In early 1942, even as smoke from Pearl Harbor still hung over the Pacific, American shipyards began performing what naval architects once called impossible surgery. With the Japanese fleet ranging freely across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy faced a single brutal equation. It could not build full-sized fleet carriers fast enough to match losses. The answer lay not in new designs, but in transformation. The plan, conceived by Admiral Ernest J. King and the Bureau of Ships, called for taking Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls already under construction and converting them into Independence-class light carriers. Instead of 18 months, as a fleet carrier demanded, the first conversion would take less than 9. Cruiser keels that had been meant for 6-inch guns would now carry flight decks. Armour was sacrificed for speed, elegance for immediacy. The conversion symbolized the American genius for improvisation at industrial scale: fuel, fighters, and flight decks as soon as possible. The experiment began at New York Shipbuilding in Camden, New Jersey. There, the hull of Amsterdam, CL-59, became the first to undergo metamorphosis. On June 25, 1942, workers cut away its upper decks and superstructure. Within weeks, prefabricated flight deck sections arrived from Bethlehem Steel, each one hoisted by crane and welded into place like pieces of a giant puzzle. A hangar deck, elevators, arresting gear, and island were grafted onto a hull never meant to carry them. By January 1943, barely 6 months later, the ship was commissioned as USS Independence CVL-22. To old-line naval officers, the conversion seemed reckless, even desperate. To Henry Kaiser and the new generation of industrial planners, it was proof that time had replaced tonnage as the currency of war. A Cleveland-class hull displaced 10,000 tons and could make over 30 knots. With a flat top and elevators, it became a small, fast carrier ideal for screening, ferrying, and rapid support. The Independence-class ships carried 30 aircraft, half the complement of a fleet carrier, but their virtue was proximity. They could escort the fast carriers into battle and fill the gaps left by those lost or damaged. While Japan still viewed shipbuilding as a sacred art, laying each keel like an offering to tradition, America had reduced it to a reproducible process. The Japanese Navy required nearly 3 years to build the fleet carrier Taiho, laid down in July 1941 and not commissioned until March 1944. In the same span, the United States commissioned 11 Independence-class light carriers and over 30 escort carriers. The disparity was more than numerical, it was philosophical. Japan built masterpieces, America built momentum. The Independence class proved itself in every major campaign from 1943 onward. Independence herself launched combat operations at Tarawa, where her small complement of Hellcats and Avengers flew continuous sorties over the beaches. Her sisters Belleau Wood, Cowpens and Cabot provided night coverage for the Essex-class carriers, relieving the larger ships for strike operations. When Lexington was damaged in the Marshalls, Princeton filled her role within days. The Pacific's distances, once Japan's shield, were now compressed by American production schedules. The conversion process was brutally efficient. Each hull was modified along nearly identical lines. Flight deck lengthened to 622 feet, elevators repositioned for balance, arresting gear standardized. Weight savings came from removing armor, secondary armament, and much of the cruiser's internal bulkheads. The ships carried fewer guns, but more fuel and aviation stores, emphasizing projection over protection. Their birth rate astonished even the Navy's Bureau of Ships. Between June 1942 and December 1943, 9 Cleveland-class hulls were transformed into carriers, an average of 1 completed every 2 months. Japanese intelligence initially dismissed reports of these conversions as exaggeration. Post-war interrogations revealed disbelief. Admiral Ugaki's diary recorded, "Americans seem to conjure carriers from air and smoke." But the truth was simpler. America had harnessed the full integration of industry and logistics. Steel mills, foundries, engine plants, and shipyards operated in synchronized rhythm. The Navy no longer waited for ships. The ships were waiting for the Navy. By 1944, the Independence-class carriers formed the nervous system of the fast carrier task forces, providing reconnaissance, ferry service, and combat air patrol. They were the connective tissue between fleet and escort carriers, light, expendable, and omnipresent. In Axis shipyards, a single vessel still embodied national pride. In American ones, pride came from repetition. The transformation from cruiser to carrier encapsulated the Industrial Revolution at war, turning half-built ships into finished solutions before the enemy could even react. In the end, the Independence class stood as testimony to a truth Yamamoto had foreseen, that America's power lay not in genius or bravery, but in velocity, the ability to turn plans into ships and ships into strategy before the ink on enemy intelligence was dry. By late 1944, the Pacific seemed to shimmer with grey silhouettes. Escort carriers, Casablanca-class, Independence-class, and their sisters, moved across the ocean in convoys so steady they appeared inexhaustible. To the Japanese High Command, these ships acquired an almost spectral reputation. Every time an American flattop was reported sunk, another appeared weeks later, fresh paint still drying, aircraft already circling her deck. "A new shadow follows every loss," wrote Commander Yoshiaki Ichikawa of the Imperial Navy. "They replace carriers like we replace planes." The phrase 100-day carriers had entered Allied slang by then, a nod to the speed with which Henry Kaiser's shipyards on the Columbia River and along the Gulf Coast could turn raw steel into fighting hulls. Each new Casablanca-class CVE was born from the same ritual clock, 100 days from keel to commissioning, another month for shakedown and loading, and then out into the Pacific under a code name and convoy number. Task Group 52.1, Taffy 2, Taffy 3, endless permutations of function and firepower. They were, on paper, auxiliaries. In practice, they became the connective tissue of the Pacific War. Their names blurred into a cadence: Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, Omane Bay, each a product of the same shipyard choreography. Every 3 weeks, another hull slid into the Columbia, its deck crowded with aircraft awaiting the first catapult launch. Every launch, in turn, reshaped Japanese intelligence. In Tokyo, planners at the Navy General Staff still worked from assumptions rooted in 1942, that replacing a carrier required a year or more. Their logistical calculus, how long America could sustain fleet actions, was already obsolete. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese staff estimated that the US Navy would need at least 6 months to recover from its own aircraft and pilot losses. Yet by August, new escort carriers were delivering replacement squadrons directly to forward bases in the Marianas. American carrier strength, instead of contracting, expanded. Japanese air officers noticed the pattern first. Captain Tamichi Hara, in his diary, wrote after the Marianas campaign, "We had expected their carrier numbers to diminish, but more appeared each month. The names are new, but the decks are the same." The speed of resurrection became a kind of psychological warfare. Even the most successful Japanese strikes, the sinking of Gambier Bay or St. Lo, produced no visible dent in American capacity. To pilots scanning the horizon, the sky above every task group looked the same, a rectangle of grey steel launching fighters without end. The Casablanca-class CVEs became ubiquitous. They ferried aircraft, fuel, and pilots across distances that had once defined the Pacific as impassable. Each could carry 30 planes, half of them replacements bound for the fast carrier fleet. Others functioned as floating depots, their decks stacked with crated Hellcats, Avengers, and Corsairs, their holds filled with aviation gasoline and munitions. The cycle was relentless: build, load, deliver, return, repeat. Japanese intelligence reports intercepted by the Allies after the war revealed disbelief bordering on despair. A 1944 combined fleet assessment estimated the US Navy possessed approximately 30 escort carriers. In reality, by that date, it had over 50. The Japanese record for new carrier construction during the same period was 0. At Leyte Gulf, the illusion of exhaustion shattered completely. When Admiral Kurita's battleships emerged through San Bernardino Strait on October 25, 1944, they confronted not the shattered remnants of America's fleet, but 6 escort carriers of Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3. The battle that followed, the Battle off Samar, became a legend of courage and chaos. The escort carriers, built to chase submarines and ferry aircraft, suddenly faced the guns of the Yamato. Their captains dodged armor-piercing shells with desperate maneuvering, while their pilots, mostly green replacements, attacked battleships with rockets and depth charges. The Japanese believed they were annihilating the last of the American carriers. Instead, within weeks, replacements arrived. The yards on the Columbia launched 3 new CVEs before Gambier Bay's wreck had even cooled. Japanese officers reading intercepted reports refused to believe them. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary that November, "It cannot be that these are new ships. Perhaps they were hidden. They were not hidden. They were scheduled." Behind every new deck stood a network of production as disciplined as any fleet. Steel from Pittsburgh arrived by rail to Portland, engines from Wisconsin shipped west, arresting gear fabricated in New Jersey. By the time a Japanese reconnaissance pilot spotted one American carrier burning, its successor was already fitting out. For every ton of Japanese ship lost, America produced 10. By early 1945, the psychological impact was complete. Japanese diaries described the Pacific as a sea of runways. What had begun as scattered carrier task forces now appeared endless, grey decks stretching beyond the horizon. The 100-day rhythm had become a weapon in itself, an industrial heartbeat that no attack could silence. Even after the war, captured Japanese officers spoke of it with disbelief. "We thought we were fighting ships," one said during interrogation in 1946, "but we were fighting factories." Every hull sliding down Kaiser's ways was a statement of continuity, a mechanical defiance of attrition. The Japanese Navy had measured war in tons of steel and barrels of oil. America had measured it in days. And in that arithmetic of time, those 100 days from first weld to wake, the Pacific War's outcome was already written. By 1945, the US Navy no longer measured power in ships or squadrons, but in tempo. Admirals carried calendars more than compasses, and the true weapon of the Pacific War had become arithmetic. How many aircraft ferried this week? How many gallons of fuel bunkered? How many tons of ammunition embarked before dawn? Battles were being fought by the clock, by the ability to replace, refuel, and rearm faster than the enemy could even register the loss. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the Casablanca-class Escort carriers. Between November 1942 and July 1944, American shipyards produced 50 of them, each roughly 10,000 tons, each launched, fitted, and commissioned in mere months. Several were completed within 100 days of keel laying, an industrial rhythm unmatched in naval history. At the peak of production, a new CVE slid into the Columbia River every 10 days, followed immediately by another entering the fitting-out basin. The river itself became a conveyor belt of war. Each ship represented the sum of 1,000 parallel schedules. While one hull was being welded, another was already receiving turbines and electrical fittings. While crews trained ashore in carrier operations, the next ship's flight deck was being painted. The system functioned like an assembly line that happened to float. The result was continuity, a seamless stream of hulls that guaranteed no operational pause, no opportunity for the enemy to recover. Every escort carrier added measurable quantities to the war's logistics. 30 aircraft ferried forward, 75,000 gallons of aviation fuel bunkered, 300 tons of ordnance embarked. Once deployed, those numbers multiplied exponentially. A single Casablanca-class ferrying mission could replenish an entire task group's air wing in a week. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics began publishing logistics reports not in tons or gallons, but in rates per day. One officer summarized it bluntly: "We are winning because we refill faster." The calendar itself became a weapon. Admiral Nimitz's staff at Pearl Harbor scheduled operations with such precision that entire invasions were planned around the predicted completion dates of ship classes. The timing of the Marianas, Philippines, and Iwo Jima campaigns aligned almost exactly with CVE delivery waves. New decks arrived not by chance, but by algorithm, a calculated expression of industrial velocity. To the Japanese, these ships seemed to appear from nothing. Their intelligence summaries after the Battle of the Philippine Sea predicted American carrier strength would decline for 6 months. Instead, it increased within 6 weeks. Every loss, Liscum Bay, Gambier Bay, Omane Bay, was absorbed by replacement. Tokyo's planners, trained in the logic of scarcity, could not comprehend production schedules measured in weeks. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary, "They do not pause to build, they have already built." By war's end, the numbers were staggering. 50 Casablanca-class CVEs in under 2 years, over 120 escort carriers of all types afloat, and nearly 8,000 aircraft transported across the Pacific by ships built faster than Japan could lay a single keel. The American calendar, once an administrative tool, had become a countdown mechanism, converting days into ships and ships into victory. In that sense, the Pacific was not merely a battlefield, but a ledger, and the Allies had mastered its accounting. The war was fought by hours, but it was won by weeks. When the war ended and the Pacific fell silent, the reckoning began, not just in tribunals or treaties, but in the quiet rooms of post-war interrogations. Officers from the Imperial Japanese Navy, men who had once commanded fleets and air flotillas, sat across from American intelligence teams in Tokyo, Guam, and Washington. The questions were deceptively simple. When did you realize the war was lost? Their answers rarely mentioned Midway or the Marianas, not even Leyte Gulf. They spoke instead of numbers, of time, of the calendar. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, once Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, phrased it bluntly during his 1946 interrogation: "We were outnumbered, yes, but more than that, we were out-timed. Every defeat came faster than calculations allowed. Every replacement arrived before logic permitted. You built not ships, but schedules. In those few words lay the essence of America's quietest superweapon, the shipyard clock. The Japanese Navy had begun the war believing it could win quickly or not at all. Its strategy relied on decisive battles and the enemy's psychological exhaustion. The Imperial Navy's planners had studied the Russo-Japanese War and Trafalgar, not Detroit or Pittsburgh. To them, industry was a backdrop, not a weapon. They assumed that even the United States, industrial giant though it was, would require months, perhaps years, to recover from losses of major warships. That belief shaped every Japanese operation from Pearl Harbor to Midway. They were wrong. By 1944, America had turned the act of shipbuilding into a kind of manufacturing religion. The Casablanca-class Escort carriers, built in just over 100 days apiece, were the most visible manifestation of a deeper transformation, the synchronization of industry, logistics, and combat into a single continuum of motion. Japan fought in campaigns, America fought in production cycles. Rear Admiral Takatsugu Jojima, who had commanded the carrier Zuikaku, admitted during his debriefing that Japanese assumptions had collapsed by 1943. "We thought your factories would slow after the first losses. Instead, we learned you built faster after losing. When we sank Liscombe Bay, we thought it victory. 2 months later, there were more carriers than before. We could not understand how steel became ships so soon. It was like fighting a tide. That tide was measured not in ships alone, but in their rhythm. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships, Henry Kaiser's yards, and the Maritime Commission had reduced the most complex vessels on Earth to a production cycle shorter than a single season. Each yard was a metronome, and every time it struck, every new hull launched, it reset the strategic balance. At the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Honolulu, former adversaries revisited those lessons without rancor. American officers brought slides of the Vancouver Yard and Todd Pacific shipbuilding. Japanese veterans studied them with the fascination of archaeologists examining lost machinery. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the air group leader who had signalled "Tora! Tora! Tora!" over Pearl Harbor, listened to a presentation describing how USS Casablanca, CVE 55, was built, launched and commissioned in 100 days. He turned to his interpreter and whispered, "1 season? Not 1 year?" The interpreter nodded. Fuchida said softly, "Then the war was lost before Midway." The audience murmured. The Americans didn't gloat. They simply nodded. It was a truth that no longer required argument. In post-war reports compiled by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, Japanese officers consistently emphasized shock, not defeat. They spoke of watching the Pacific fill with new ships faster than their intelligence estimates could keep up. Captain Toshio Hashimoto of the 4th Air Fleet wrote, "Every time we believed we had destroyed your striking power, a new wave of ships arrived. The codes changed, the names changed, but the number of decks never decreased. We realized you had replaced the concept of battle with the concept of schedule. To Japan's wartime planners, this was incomprehensible. Their shipyards at Kure and Yokosuka were temples of craftsmanship, each vessel a work of naval art, each launch a ceremony. Even in the late war, they were still hammering rivets by hand, shaping armor plates one at a time. The average construction cycle for a Japanese carrier exceeded 3 years. Taiho, the pride of the fleet, had taken 32 months. When it was sunk during its first operation in 1944, there was nothing to replace it. Meanwhile, American yards had launched 50 Casablanca-class Escort carriers in less than 2 years. The contrast was absolute. In 1985, at a Pacific Theatre veterans reunion in Honolulu, retired Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was asked by an American historian what single factor had most demoralized his officers. He smiled faintly and replied, "When we learned that your small carriers were built in 100 days. We used to think God favored us because we trained for decades. Then we realized you had made your factories your army." He paused, then added, "You fought by calendar. We fought by courage. The calendar won. It was not self-pity, it was precision." Historians later quantified what Ozawa and Fukudome had intuited. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States launched more than 1,200 major naval vessels, including 50 Casablanca-class CVEs, 26 Essex-class fleet carriers, and hundreds of destroyers and landing ships. Japanese production in the same period dwindled to fewer than 10 carriers and a handful of cruisers. But the statistics tell only part of the story. The deeper truth was resilience at tempo, the ability to absorb loss, learn from it, and replace it faster than it could matter. For every American ship sunk, there was another already half-built, its frame rising under floodlights, its engines arriving by rail. The shipyard clock, synchronized across time zones and industries, turned war into logistics and logistics into inevitability. A 1947 Navy War College report phrased it with engineer's simplicity. When a ship can be replaced faster than it can be sunk, the equation of attrition reverses. That reversal had destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy more surely than any bomb or torpedo. At the National World War II Museum, a section of a Casablanca-class flight deck is preserved, grey steel, rivets still scorched from salt and sun. Visitors walk across it without realizing that its real significance lies not in combat, but in time. It represents the transformation of industrial possibility into strategic certainty. Each weld, each rivet, each crane swing was a tick of a vast clock that no enemy could stop. The war in the Pacific was not won solely in the skies above Midway or the seas off Leyte. It was won in the rhythmic clang of hammers on the Columbia River, in the glow of welders working through night shifts, in the relentless adherence to schedule. The shipyard clock, unseen and unheralded, was the metronome of victory. When Admiral Raymond Spruance was asked after the war what factor most decided the Pacific campaign, he did not mention intelligence or even courage. He simply said, "We had time." And we kept it. The Japanese called it American magic. It was no magic at all, only math, machinery, and minutes transformed into strategy. The lesson of the ways is this. The true measure of power in modern war is not what a nation can destroy, but how quickly it can rebuild. The United States had turned the calendar into a weapon, and in 1945, when the last ship slid from the ways, the echo that followed was not victory's roar, but the ticking of a clock that had already decided the outcome years before.